I'll switch to English now, which has to do with the fact that our next speaker comes from the United States. We were fortunate enough to visit Joshua Benton, who is the director of the Nieman Lab at Harvard University, a few months ago. We were impressed by Boston, by Harvard, by most of all by Mr. Benton. We talked about news, newspapers, journalism in general, and when we left, we all felt as if we understood all those issues a little bit better. I hope you will have the same experience. We ask him to come to Holland and speak at our Congress. So, ladies and gentlemen, please, a warm welcome to Mr. Joshua Benton.
That's all the Dutch I know.
Just give me a second to switch it.
Sure.
Oh, sorry, just go on. Sure.
Hello, everyone. I apologize in advance for making you all listen to English for a while. The only Dutch word that I know beyond having Googled hallo publiek was lekker, because I used to have a girlfriend whose last name was Lekker, and she was very happy that the name had implications of beauty and whatever other implications it may have, I'm not sure. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks to the organization for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure to be in your country. It's interesting that the theme of this event is courage or guts, as it might be translated into English. I work at the Nieman Foundation at Harvard, and one of the things that we do every year is we give out an award called the Louis Lyons Award for Conscience and Integrity in Journalism. But informally, we call it a prize for courage in journalism. And traditionally, that award has gone to a war correspondent or a journalist who's working in very difficult circumstances under an oppressive regime. This past year's went to Mohammed Nabous, the Libyan citizen journalist who was shot while live streaming from Libya during the difficulties there. But I think it is true that it takes courage to do something not nearly as bold as we go to a war zone or get shot at, but nonetheless to walk away from or to realize the need to expand the business model, the workflows, the ideas that you've built up in some cases decades of building a profession like newspaper journalism or television journalism. All the professionalization of the field means a standardization of practices. And I think it's a time that we really need to be very bold in thinking beyond those practices, taking the best of the old model and combining it with something new. I want to just basically, I'll hopefully be pretty quick both to get us back on schedule and to leave time for questions afterwards. But I just want to talk about some trends that we're seeing from the vantage point of Boston. And I do acknowledge from the beginning that this is a US-centric point of view that I'm bringing. Apologies for the times that may not overlap with the point of view from Amsterdam, and I'm very curious to hear about those cases. So very quickly, just 12 trends that we're seeing that we're interested in that we think are going to be helping to define the near future. And I've sort of divided them into three groups. Ongoing trends, things that you've already heard about, that you know that have been going on for some time. Rising trends that are sort of reaching a new peak at this point. And approaching trends that I think we're only going to see the real impact in the next year or two. All right, so let's get started. First, some ongoing ones. The growth of paywalls. In the United States, finally, after years of talking about it, in the last year, newspapers have started to take action and start charging for their content online. The big marker, and in many cases in the United States, newspapers like to wait for the New York Times to do anything before they decide it's safe for them to do it themselves. And that seemed to have been the case with their paywall. And when the New York Times paywall launched a year ago, it seems to hit a really nice balance of allowing open access to most people, allowing us a fairly healthy number of free articles per month in order to maintain a solid online advertising business and to keep that revenue stream alive, while generating money from the best customers that a newspaper has, the regular readers who really consider it essential. The New York Times most recent data showed that their digital subscribers had surpassed 450,000, which is a good number. And that has inspired other smaller papers who are not that much smaller than the Times in print circulation, but much smaller in scope, to follow along. The Boston Globe has 19,000 digital subscribers, a much smaller number, and one that I suspect isn't going to get that much higher. The Dallas Morning News, where I used to work as an investigative reporter and foreign correspondent, is about 49,000. And many other papers are moving in this direction. I think at this point, a year into this wave of paywalls, that it's fair to call it a modest success. Newspapers have figured out a way to build them in such a way that they do not push away the audience to an extent that it's killing the good side of their digital business. Still a controversial point, but it's also given, perhaps even more importantly, given print subscribers a reason not to leave, not to walk away, reducing the amount of churn in subscriptions and maintaining the, in many cases, very high prices, at least from an American perspective, that daily newspapers charge, $700, $800 a year. The second one, another thing that has been going on for some time, is the quest for more cheap and/or free content. I think it's a very smart model that Betsy Morgan, the former CEO of the Huffington Post, puts forward about how she tries to think about building an online native news operation and media operation. Her aim for the Huffington Post was to divide their content into three tranches. One-third of their energy going into original professional content, which is largely in the form of reported journalism, very traditional. One-third into voice and opinion-based journalism, which can often be attained quite cheaply or for free. And one-third smart aggregation and curation, the idea that if you have a news site, you know your audience, you know the kinds of things your audience is interested in, and you can perform the service of filtering through the rest of the web and the rest of the internet to give them what they need. This is an area where newspapers are still lagging behind. The world of cheap and free content has almost entirely focused on independent platforms that are not attached to media companies like YouTube, like Twitter, like Facebook, where lots of people create an enormous amount of free content every single day. Newspapers' experiments in this area have lagged behind, and it's an area where newspapers are really still trying to figure out what they're doing. The third, mobile. Anybody remember when phones were that big? But not the small one, the big one. Mobile is, I think, the sleeping giant in our conversations in the United States, at least, around news. Because mobile is getting faster, more quickly than most people had anticipated. We just did an interview with Talking Points Memo, one of the premier political sites in the United States. Their founder, Josh Marshall, said that now over 30% of their visits come from a mobile device. We expect by the end of this year it'll be approaching 50%. We see the similar pattern across lots of platforms. And this is an area where news organizations realize they need to do something, but they're not quite sure what it is they're supposed to do. Lots of media people took comfort when Facebook filed for their initial public offering not too long ago, and in one of their documents, in their filing document, they sort of acknowledged that Facebook has no idea how to make any money off of mobile devices. They're pretty good at making money off of you visiting their site in a desktop browser on your laptop. They really don't know how to do it, make money off of a phone or off of a tablet. And news organizations are very much in the same boat. You're seeing some experimentation. You're seeing news organizations start to think of apps on smartphones in particular as being a family of apps. The New York Times has released, for example, a specific politics app, a specific fashion app, to try and get into the nichification that apps on mobile devices encourage. And we also see an interesting trend of lots of magazines in the United States that decided to invest heavily in the iPad when the iPad came along, now wanting to transfer that back into smartphones. Business Week recently moved their iPad edition to also being an iPhone edition. The New Yorker last week announced similar plans. And I think we're starting to see that some of the magical impulses that were driven by this device and the ideas that it would be a media-saving idea, some of that potential is turning out to be true, but a lot of it is also pushing towards smartphones, which are still far more popular and are in many more of our pockets these days. And last on this set, more emphasis on Sundays. Now I understand Sunday is not always the same equivalent here, maybe it's Saturday here, but the large weekend product. In the United States, newspapers have lost most of their pricing power. If you go back 20 years ago, because of the somewhat unique circumstances of the American newspaper market, most large newspapers had local monopolies. They were the only daily newspaper in town. As a result, they were able to set extravagant advertising rates and make an enormous amount of money. That pricing power has mostly disappeared, but there's one place where it still exists, and that's in preprint advertisements put into the Sunday paper. The Sunday paper also fits into the sort of news consumption style that people have. As you know, morning newspapers, which are the vast majority of daily newspapers in the United States and most other parts of the world. Those newspapers are simply harder to put into our morning routines than they used to be. Not as many of us have 30 minutes to sit at the breakfast table and read a paper. So Sunday is where a lot of the emphasis is going. And a lot of the digital subscription strategies that I mentioned earlier are aimed really at supporting the Sunday print product. I think I can be an example of this myself. I had not subscribed to a print newspaper for over a decade. But when the New York Times digital subscription model launched last year, I decided, I did the math, and the cheapest way to get access to the New York Times digitally was actually to get a print subscription to the Sunday paper. That was cheaper than actually buying a digital subscription because you got a digital subscription free with the Sunday paper. So essentially the New York Times is paying me to accept a small pile of paper every Sunday morning that I never actually read because I've read it all online anyway. The newsier piece comes from an example of the Minneapolis Star-Tribune paper, which was discussed earlier. They have found increased Sunday circulation. For the first time in this first quarter of this year, the Star-Tribune had an increase in revenue over the year-ago quarter. That's the first time that it happened since 2006. And a lot of people were happy to see, even if it's a very small positive number, just any positive number. Gosh, we were rooting for that. We all have access to so much information that whereas it was once a news organization's role and primary service to provide information, in some cases now that service can shift into being a filter for information. We're seeing a new generation of aggregation tools being developed that provide smart curated content around a certain topic area. We have one of our own at Nieman Lab that we've built called Fuego. News.me, Storify in some ways serves this purpose. All these tools are aimed at eliminating the madness that comes with the onslaught of information that social media and the web present to us every day. Another piece of this is that I think we're seeing an increase in news organization products that provide a sense of completeness. When you interview people who still get the print newspaper and love the print newspaper, one of the frequent remarks that they make as to why they love the product is that they know when it's finished. They flip through it, they get to the end, they can put it away, and they're done. Whereas the internet does not have an endpoint. You will never click around to something and find, oh, I'm sorry, you've run out of web pages. So that sense of completeness is something that, for example, iPad magazine editions provide very well, better than magazine websites. We're seeing daily emails that previously dumped everything that a news organization had produced in the previous 24 hours being reduced to 3 or 4 items because market research is finding that people react better to a finite universe of information. And I think that there's a lot of room for innovation here, and news organizations are good at creating an edited, tight product. I think it's a space where we're going to see some interesting work in the next year or so. Next is repackaging. News is extremely expensive to produce compared to many other kinds of product. You have to produce a whole new set of it every day. And when entrepreneurs talk about getting started with figuring out what kind of a business they want to start, often they say that content is not the business they want to be in because you have to keep doing it. You can never rest on your laurels. You have to keep producing new stuff. So one thing I think we're starting to see is news organizations be a bit smarter about reusing the same content, repackaging the same content in multiple forms. Can a series that has been produced be repackaged into an ebook and then sold for actual cash money on Kindle or other platforms? The National Post in Canada is putting out at a pretty rapid pace about one ebook a month. Some of them compiling previously published columns, some of them compiling long-form series that were produced together. Some are working with the Kindle Singles program like ProPublica. Others are going across platform. Others, as news organizations try to create more of a membership identity with their subscribers, this is something the Boston Globe and the LA Times are doing. They're trying to use ebooks and other kinds of products as a way to create a stronger relationship. So the Boston Globe, for example, has a weekly column on cooking a Sunday dinner. So they've compiled all those into a cookbook that is available for free, but only to print subscribers and digital subscribers as well. If you have an investigative story that relies on the accumulation of a large government database, you can produce that into a story, but can you also put that database online in a way that it will be searchable and reusable and have a life that goes far beyond the actual story? And that leads nicely into data. Data visualization tools keep growing and keep getting easier. Tools like Google Fusion Tables and Tableau Public and ManyEyes, they keep getting easier to use, and they're only going to keep going in that direction. What was a complicated task from a data visualization perspective 3 years ago is now a pretty simple task and will become dead simple in another 2 years. Data can be an enormously successful audience strategy. The Texas Tribune, one of the star nonprofits that has been founded in the last few years in the United States, has built up a substantial audience, and 2/3 of their page views on their website are not to news stories. They're actually to these enormous state databases that they were able to obtain from the state of Texas, format in a user-friendly and search-optimized way, and then publish on their website. These are huge resources of data that are available to the public, but in a very confusing, un-user-friendly form. By making a relatively small investment, the Texas Tribune was able to turn that into a substantial audience win. Tools like Document Cloud, which is produced by the New York Times and ProPublica, are a part of this generation of tools that have both a reporting angle and an audience angle. It both lets reporters do their job better, and it also provides a new service to the audience. And I think that we're going to be seeing more tools that enable news organizations to create things that are meant to be explored as opposed to simply consumed. One thing that news organizations all suffer from is a very short time on site. The average time on site for an American newspaper site is just about 1 minute per visit. If you look at an average American newspaper site over a month's time, you might get 8 minutes on an average for a visitor. Compare that to about 8 hours that Facebook has. So anything that encourages people to spend more time on your site and explore and feel engaged with it, not just in a click-read fashion, is valuable. And this is one area where gamification, which we were talking about earlier, and bringing game dynamics in can be extremely useful. We just had a story earlier this week about MTV's effort to try and create a fantasy football style game for the upcoming presidential election, where candidates will score you points or lose you points depending on whether they're caught lying. Should be interesting. And the last of this chunk, events. Many newspapers have long done events, of course, candidate forums and things like that. And business magazines the joke always was that most business magazines are actually profitable events businesses attached to an unprofitable actual magazine. But I think that these are still very much underused as a use of the convening power of a news organization. It shows that you own a topic. And again, here the Texas Tribune is a leader. They have built a pretty healthy revenue stream by selling sponsorships to many series of breakfasts and lunch and other events with political figures. They have a Texas Tribune festival based on the New Yorker Festival, which you see back up here. And it's turned into a very good way to both increase community engagement and make some money. All right, the last thing I'll talk about are 4 things that we are seeing coming. Some of these have already arrived to a certain degree, but I think these are things that we're not going to see the full impact for a little while. One is a rebirth of live online video. Some news organizations have felt burned the last few years by their experiments in video not working out. A lot of news organizations invested a lot before the economic collapse into video, did not find that they were getting the returns in terms of viewership. I think they were a little bit early, but I think we really are turning a corner, and particularly with all video, but in particularly with live video. You see the big dogs are really investing a lot into it. The Wall Street Journal now with WSJ Live now produces 4.5 hours of original live video every day. Reuters TV is doing a lot with YouTube. Bloomberg is doing a lot. But you also see smaller papers getting interested in this. The Denver Post recently launched a noon newscast. The Boston Globe last month launched a noon sports show. These are live produced shows that try to do 2 things. One, they try to take advantage of the fact that a lot of people are sitting at their desk looking for something to do at work, and playing a video can be one way to entertain themselves. It's creating that sort of appointment viewing sense that a television program has. So they're really trying to wait for an opportunity to disrupt local television. And also, they're also trying to prepare themselves for the day, and I'm not smart enough to know whether this day is 1 year away, 5 years away, whatever it is, the day when traditional television gets disrupted and becomes reduced to a series of apps and channels that are distinct and do not require going through the cable process or the satellite process. Most newspapers are nowhere near have the ability to launch a television network, but at a point when content becomes more on demand, when channels become defined by app choices as opposed to cable choices, it's good to be invested in video, particularly live video, so you can get ready for that. Another area that we're seeing a lot of interesting work is in the disruption of education. Now, as a former newspaper reporter and as someone who came up in that field, I, for one, have been itching for the chance to disrupt somebody else's business instead of what's happened the last 10 years, which is my business has gotten disrupted over and over again. And I used to be an education reporter, and I can tell you that higher education in particular is just ripe for disruption. I think, again, at least in the United States, the universities are about 10 years behind newspapers in terms of where they are at having their business model ripped out from underneath them. They're both knowledge-based businesses. They're both businesses that have had something like a market monopoly. In the university's case, it's the market monopoly to issue degrees and establish credits. But as you probably know, there's tons of activity in this space of people who are, both traditional institutions and new startups that are trying to get into the education business and do so in a way that's more efficient than what in the United States at my university, Harvard, is, $70,000 a year to attend. The New York Times is a leader here. They've partnered with a number of established universities in the United States, so you can actually now take a class taught by a New York Times reporter, an online class that you then earn college credit towards a degree for. And that's I think, one of the early steps in a process that will lead to particularly the larger news organizations figuring out, hey, we know how to tell people things. We know how to give people information. Maybe there's room for us to move into the education business. The third trend that I think we're going to have to see, this is more aspirational than a prediction, although I think it will come true. Doing a better job of retaining side door traffic. And by side door traffic, I mean people who come to your website through routes that are not the front page, your home page. It used to be, even just a couple years ago, quite common for a large news site to get 50, 60, maybe 70% of its visits starting by someone going to the home page, visiting a bookmark, typing the web address into their browser. In many cases, that has just in the last couple of years dropped to 25 to 30%. In other words, these other people are coming in through search results, through social media, through other forms. They're coming in at the article page. To put some other statistics on that, The Atlantic, which is, was a fusty old monthly magazine for many decades and has really reinvented itself as a digital-first organization, reports that 13% of their visits go through the homepage now. So 87% of their visits come in through the side door. And I can say from our own statistics at Nieman Lab, our readers are, sort of on the leading edge of digital things. It's only 7% of our visits start on the homepage. Everything else is coming in through the side. So what does a boom in side door traffic mean? It means that you've got to shift your advertising strategy so you're not overselling the value of the homepage if that's not how people are going to be coming in. It means you have to do a better job of directing people to another story when they come in at an article page. You can't trust they're going to hit the back arrow to go back to the homepage because the back arrow won't take them there. And finally, you really need to figure out what the right call to action is for your reader in order to convert them into someone more regular as a reader. Is it that you want them to follow you on Twitter? Is it that you want them to sign up for your email newsletter? What is it that you want them to do that will help convert them into the kind of people for whom your brand is important? And related to that, when there are a number of startups that are trying to work on those questions now, and I think one thing we're going to see, if we all meet again in 5 years, we will look back and think how comically bad we all were, news organizations and other websites, at targeting readers, either for advertising purposes or for content purposes. It's a scary, privacy infringing world, but nonetheless, I think that cat is out of the bag. We're going to get a lot better at figuring out how to predict exactly what the next article to serve up to you is. And finally, my last point is object-oriented reporting, object-oriented journalism. For anyone who comes from the technology world, object-oriented programming is a model of programming that has really sort of taken over the last decade or so, which basically tries to, instead of thinking of code as a stream of commands, it tries to think of unique objects, classes and instances of those classes. It's, programming talk. But what object-oriented reporting in journalism means is to not think of journalism as simply a stream of stories in which the story is the defining characteristic of the defining output of your work. It's to instead think, how would our work be different if we tried to orient and organize and do our work around specific objects? There's one example I want to point out here, Homicide Watch DC, which is a one-woman startup run by a woman named Laura Amico. She moved to Washington, D.C., did not have a job. She followed her husband there. And she decided that she was an old crime reporter, and she decided she wanted to chronicle every murder in the city of Washington. And this is not a model that would transfer well to cities that don't have as many murders as Washington. But so instead of thinking of stories being the unit of content the way that a newspaper might, she thinks of the crime as the unit of content. So all the content on her site is focused around the person who has been killed, the suspects around that crime. So she compiles all the documents that relate to that crime. She provides a nice calendar of all the court appearances related to that crime. She provides a resource that isn't tied to a story, but is tied to the victim and to the crime for people to engage with that. And she has, in a short, again, working by herself, built a site that gets somewhere in the area of 400,000 unique visits a month, just by, from nothing. And I think there's power in figuring out ways to organize your reporting and your work around objects, whether that's a school, if you're a school reporter, specific school districts, specific universities, crimes in this case. This is a time that does take a lot of courage, I believe, to adapt to all these things. The things that I mentioned and many others that we're interested in at Nieman Lab are all throwing our traditional model asunder. But I'm optimistic that journalists are proving able to adapt. They're proving able to change the way that they do their work. The business side is perhaps having a slower time of it, but I think that they're coming along. And if we can embrace our ability to be agile and to be adept and to rethink the way that we do things, to have the courage to reconsider those things, I think that we will get through it. Thank you.
Thank you, Joshua. Joshua will not return for a theme session, so if there are any questions, this is the right moment to ask them.
I will be in the entrepreneurial journals.
Yeah, he will be here, so you're... Dat ga ik maar niet doen. Zijn er mensen in de zaal met vragen? Well, I have one. You talked about the Texas Tribune. I read a little bit about that. If I understand correctly, it's a news organization funded by private people and not aimed at making profit. That sounds very un-American. What's the story behind that?
It doesn't just sound un-American, it sounds un-Texan as well. The Texas Tribune is a small news organization. I think they have somewhere around 20 reporters at this point, 20 reporters and editors. And they are dedicated to just covering Texas state government. They're based in Austin, and so they cover the governor, the legislature, and the worlds of business and lobbying around that. And they were started by a venture capitalist who decided he had made enough money and wanted to give $1 million of it to start a nonprofit news organization. In the United States, we have seen an enormous wave of nonprofit news organizations being started, but most of them were not started by smart business people. This is an exception. And as a result, they have been very cagey about figuring out ways to use the advantage they have in that their audience is filled with lots of powerful people. So they do take some foundation money. They take donations from wealthy individuals and from corporations. But they also have this thriving events business and this data business, and they're doing quite well for themselves. And I think compared to the dozens, maybe even hundreds of other nonprofit news organizations that have started in the last few years, they are very high up in terms of the likelihood that they're going to find a sustainable model and persist.
Okay. Great. Maybe it's something for the Netherlands too. Who knows? Any questions? Jan Bierhoff. Wil je deze microfoon even hebben misschien? Oh, Bas heeft een microfoon. There's a mic over there.
Definitely. Tosho, what exactly comes out of the lab? Are these studies, overviews, basically knowledge, or are you also producing prototypes, proof of concepts, and what have you?
Sure. Well, a lot of times when people hear our name, they imagine us with lab coats, with beakers and Bunsen burners and performing science experiments. I usually describe what we do as 85% newsroom and 15% think tank. So I have a staff of 3 reporters, young reporters, who do a fine job of, their beat is journalism innovation. So they write lots of stories about what's going on. We're moving into doing more events and having more structured analyses and longer white papers and things like that. In addition, we also do a bit of technological exploration ourselves. I mentioned Fuego, which is our Twitter aggregation tool that we've built that we're planning on open sourcing for other news organizations to use. So we're interested in that piece of it. Yeah, we are a small operation. Harvard does not have a journalism school and has always been very suspicious of journalism as a dirty, dirty field. So they do not have a large portion of the university dedicated to working on journalism, but we try to do good work in our little corner in the basement.
Okay, thanks.
You talked a lot about the new trends that you're seeing, but mostly they're for the written press. Can you share one trend that you see for audiovisual journalists?
Well, I did mention the live video piece, which I think is part of it. Oh, sure.
Because it's interesting, you were talking about newspapers or newspaper-oriented or websites producing video. I am an audiovisual journalist. I never think I can make a newspaper. How come newspapers always think they can do video? And then they have to fold it because it doesn't work. They show somebody reading the newspaper on television. Well, so give me something else. Give me another trend.
Do you publish anything on the web? Are you a programmer? I mean, I think we all have to cross platforms a bit here.
That's true. That's true. But I don't pretend I already know where the newspapers often think they can. You know, we've had some really bad examples here in the Netherlands of newspapers trying to do video. It was awful. So give us something new.
Sure. Well, just to respond to that as well, I think you've seen a lot, newspapers when they're approached to video take very different approaches. So the New York Times has really gone two ways. One, they have a very talented staff of photographers, and they've tried to train those and oftentimes produce some really excellent work. On the other hand, they have also tried to partner with documentary filmmakers. One of the most interesting things they've done is a feature they announced last year called OpDocs. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's the idea, it's actually run under the opinion section, and it's an op-ed, but in 5-minute or so video form, produced by documentary filmmakers who don't work for the Times. The Times pays them, and the filmmakers are happy to have a large audience for the work that they've done. And those have proved to be pretty successful. You know, beyond that, and the general interest in video more broadly, one other point on that. It is true that one thing that news organizations, whether television or newspapers, have found in the move online is that video that works well in one medium doesn't work well in another. For example, it's astonishing to me, or at one level it's astonishing, that local television stations in the United States produce less video, and their video is less watched than newspapers in the United States. Now, you would think television stations know how to produce video. Well, they do, but they know how to produce, you know, local television video, which is not something that people want to sit in, the sort of packages that people want to watch online in the same way. Some newspapers have gone more in a documentary filmmaking model. Some have moved towards, let's just do raw, just from the scene, unedited style. I think we're trying to figure out what the right balance is, and it's going to differ substantially from every news organization. So the New York Times has a brand that doesn't let them do cheap stuff. So they have to do nice, polished, you know, work. For a local blogger who doesn't have that same reputation, raw video can work perfectly well. One other thing that I'll say on audio video is that we're seeing an interesting movement in podcasting that traditional news organizations that invested a fair amount in podcasting 3, 4, 5 years ago, many of them are walking away from it because they're finding that the style of podcast that they were doing was not connecting with readers, or with the audience, I should say, listeners. Where at the same time, podcasting outside of that is really back on a growth swing. And we're seeing independent networks of podcasters. We're seeing a lot of, we're still seeing the continuation of what the smartphone enabled, the ability to actually, you know, stream things while you're out, not having to, you know, dock your iPod and all the rest. So I think that's an area where we're going to see more growth, but it's not going to be within traditional media companies. It sort of reminds me of where the blogging world was 10 years ago. When, you know, I started blogging 14 years ago, I guess, and there was that early stage where it was an independent thing. The big guys just made fun of it, said it was a terrible thing, this dastardly idea that people were allowed to share their opinions with anyone else. And before they co-opted it and all had 60 blogs of their own. And I think podcasting is in a similar sort of stage.
Thank you. I have one last question for you. Why did you send a picture of your son? Is that
I don't know. I look fondly on my 20s. I don't know. That photo is probably 10 years old at this point. I don't know. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, well.
Okay. Thank you, Joshua Benton.
Thank you.